This is what core postural alignment is all about. It's about our interaction with gravity. Now, about the only thing I remember from school physics is Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if gravity is pulling us down towards the Earth, then there must be an equal and opposite force pushing us up from the Earth. That is, if Newton's correct. And in fact there is. It's called the ground reaction force. And if the ground reaction force and gravity counteract each other completely, as Newton's third law implies, equal and opposite, it means that we can maintain an upright posture with ease and poise and grace, and we're not really affected by the gravity, which is constantly pulling us down, because the ground reaction force will hold us up. The more able that the ground reaction force holds us up, then that's termed efficiency. Now, many of these terms come from engineering, as the person who developed the original technique was an engineer. So the better able that ground reaction force is able to counteract gravity is known as efficiency. The better it does this means that the more efficient the body is, mechanically speaking. So we have a notional point called the centre of gravity, where the gravity appears to act from. We also have another notional point called the counterweight, which is where the ground reaction force comes to a focus. If these 2 points are correctly aligned, then the 2 forces will counteract each other. If they do it optimally, that's referred to as the static upright physiologically efficient posture, called the physiological posture for short, or more commonly, the PEP. The PEP means that the body is using the absolute minimum amount of resources to hold itself up against the constant pull of gravity. Well, we only have to look around at people to realise that many people aren't holding themselves up with ease and poise and grace. So there must be some kind of disconnect between these 2 points. The ground reaction force and gravity mustn't be balancing each other. Well, in theory, all we'd have to do is determine when the centre of gravity is, determine where the counterweight is. If they're not correct, then bring them back to a more normal or optimal relationship so that people can experience this ease and poise and grace. So to actually be able to do that, we need to know where the centre of gravity should be and where the counterweight of the body should be. Now, to do that is actually extremely difficult. It's a really difficult thing to do. If you're standing and you lift an arm up, the centre of gravity shifts. If you turn your foot out, then the way the ground reaction force comes up the body shifts. It's really difficult. And they are constantly changing around each other as we move. It's a constant dance between them. So how on earth are you supposed to find out where they're supposed to be? Now, this isn't a new question. People have been trying to solve this problem for many, many years. In fact, in 1914, a chiropractor called John Hurley was wrestling with exactly the same issues. He felt that, gosh, if only there was a particular posture where we could work out where the centre of gravity should be and where the counterweight should be. And if it was like that, then as the body moved, they'd keep their correct relative interaction going. Now, John Hurley was a structural mechanical engineer before he became a chiropractor, so he had an advantage over the rest of us. So he decided to set about finding out where the centre of gravity and counterweight should be in this one particular posture, which we now call the physiological efficient posture. It was a slight variation on what we know as the anatomical position, the posture we see on our anatomical charts. So 15 short years later, he was able to say that in this one specific posture, he felt reasonably confident about saying that the centre of gravity is here and the counterweight is here. Of course, this was long before the advent of computers, so it took him 15 years. He worked in conjunction with another chiropractor called Helen Sanders, and they experimented and calculated, measured, put people on rollers, put people on all sorts of strange apparatus to try and determine these things. Now, I need at this point just to make some disclaimers. First of all, I'm not a structural and mechanical engineer, so I'm just reporting what John Hurley said. Secondly, I'm not a physicist, so I don't understand resultant forces in perhaps the way I should. And thirdly, I'm not a mathematician, so I can't check the maths on this, so I have to take it on trust that his maths were correct. Now, if you talk to anyone who's interested in the effects of gravity on structures, they will talk about an area called the centre of mass. And the centre of mass is dependent on the density and the lengths of all the different parts of that structure. So for instance, our bodies have a centre of mass, and that depends on how long your legs are, how broad your shoulders are, whether you have big beefy arms or little spindly arms. It all affects the position of the centre of mass. Now, in static objects of uniform density, the centre of mass is exactly the same place as the centre of gravity. Gravity appears to work from the centre of mass. Similarly, the ground reaction forces meet at the same point. So when physicists talk about static objects of uniform density, the centre of mass, centre of gravity, and the counterweight are all the same place. But in dynamic structures, that differs. We have a centre of mass, depending on our body shape, size, weight and density of bones, etc. But at some point, the weight of the upper body has to go down through the sacrum, otherwise it wouldn't be transmitted down your legs and into the ground. So the body will use its tensile structures, muscles, ligaments, tendons, that type of thing, to bring the weight of the body onto the disc between L5 and S1, irrespective of where the centre of mass is. That's why we call the centre of gravity a notional point. It's different to the centre of mass. Now, when we look at this ground reaction force, this was actually a much easier calculation for John Hurley to make. In this particular posture, the ground reaction forces come to a common focus at the third sacral segment. And in theory, you would think that this is where the centre of gravity should be, because that's where they come together. And in fact, on some anatomical charts, you will see the third sacral segment marked as the body's centre of gravity. It's actually the centre of gravity of the sacrum, but not the centre of gravity of the body. And this is what really shocked John Hurley. He couldn't work it out, because when he did all these measurements and calculations with all these people, he found that gravity seemed to be acting from the L5-S1 joint, actually just anterior to the L5-S1 joint. And so he had to postulate this other notional point of the counterweight, because they were in different positions. And if you look at the slide here, you can see it in a diagrammatic form. You've got the weight of the body coming down onto the front of the sacrum, and the ground reaction force coming up into the centre of the sacrum, and that's actually a bit of an instability. It's an area of instability as they're not in the same place. So John Hurley called this area of instability the loose link. Now he felt that this had come about because essentially we changed a quadrupedal structure into a bipedal one. We spent most of our evolutionary past as a four-legged creature, and as we stood upright, the structure had to adapt to bipedalism, even though we hadn't evolved as a bipedal structure. And so this left this area of instability called the loose link. So why aren't we falling down all the time? Well, John Hurley felt that all the tensile tissues around the pelvis acted a bit like a spring and offset the shortfall. And in this diagram of John Hurley's here, you can sort of see that the resultant force line going down through the sacrum and into the head of the greater trochanter looks a bit like a spring. It's an idea that the tensile structure makes up the shortfall between the balancing of gravity and ground reaction force. Now, of course, nowadays we'd refer to all this as being the property of a tensegrity structure. And if you've been in bodywork for the last 10 or 15 years, you must have been living in a cave if you hadn't heard. The Tensegrity Model, this is the new big model for how bodies hold themselves upright. Although back in the 1920s, they didn't have the term tensegrity. Actually, engineers knew all about them empirically. If you think of a sailing ship, the mainmast fastens into the keel plate. In fact, John Hurley used this self-same analogy himself. The weight of the mast is transferred into the keel. But when you put sails on the mast, and the wind blows it forwards, then the centre of mass is taken forward, but gravity still has to be transferred to the keel plate. So what boats do is they use tensile structures, the rigging, to counteract that excess movement forward and bring the weight of everything back down into the keel plate. So he felt that these tensile structures around the pelvis would correct this disparity between the centre of gravity and the counterweight. And in fact, his techniques assess what was going on with these tissues, and when he developed corrective techniques, they were designed to change or reset those tensile structures so this balance would be restored. And you can see from this little diagram here that in this one there is someone leaning forward and the little spring shape of the resultant forces isn't being made. So his technique then was designed to measure the differences in the tissue that hold the centre of gravity in place and to correct that. That then brings gravity and the ground reaction force back into balance, and we attain an upright posture with ease and poise and grace. Hooray! Now, we found out about this in 1996. We were the principal and senior practical tutors at the McTimoney Chiropractic College in Oxford, and we were training chiropractors. Now, in all the chiropractic training we'd had, and the subsequent training we were delivering, no one was considering the effects of gravity on the structure. When we treat someone, they're lying prone, they're not upright in the gravity field, and we wanted to know why. Now, we had come across a book by Lamar Rosequist, an American chiropractor, called the Encyclopedia of the Spinal Touch Treatment, which dealt with gravity and the body. This was long before the days of easy internet access, but eventually we tracked him down after 2 years. He was living in Utah. You see, any book published in America has to have a copy lodged with the Library of Congress, and you have to give details about the author. Now, I was treating the head librarian of my city at the time, and he was able to make an interlibrary request for the author's details and got us the chiropractor's address for when the book was published. Well, we sent a letter which was forwarded on until eventually we got in touch with Lamar. Now, this brings us on to the next bit. This technique that John Hurley and Helen Sanders developed has gone through many names and many incarnations throughout its history. He started this in 1914, and in 1929, when he and Helen Sanders released it into the wild, they called it Aquarian Age Healing, which was a pretty avant-garde title for 1929. They then went on to change the name to bioengineering and later to neuropractic. However, John Hurley and Helen Sanders divorced in the 1930s, and John Hurley took on other people to help him teach the technique. He taught a chiropractor called Francis Goes, who became an instructor for John Hurley. Lamar learnt the technique from Francis Goes, and because about 30 years had passed, he encouraged Lamar to refine the technique for his generation, given the new understanding about how bodies worked. So Lamar decided that he would change the name because at that time the stage musical Hair was involved. You know, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. So the term Aquarian Age Healing was equated with hippies taking their clothes off. So he decided that as he'd revamped it, he changed the name originally to German Therapology. Thankfully, he was talked out of that and called it Spinal Touch. Later, he changed the name to Biomechanics. Now, when we went over in 1998 to learn the technique from him, and because of our history training chiropractors, he asked us if we would teach the technique in Europe. So we did his tutor training program. Now, those who knew of the technique in the UK tended to know it as Spinal Touch, because Lamar came to the UK in 1981 to give a demonstration when he was still calling it Spinal Touch. And as some people had been teaching the technique from out of Lamar's book, we felt we needed a name that differentiated us from what had gone before. Now, Lamar was adamant that this was strictly an add-on technique and it should be integrated into what you already practiced. So we called the technique Ishtar Spinal Touch. Ishtar stood for Integrating Spinal Health with Therapeutic Approaches. However, Lamar encouraged us to refine it again for our generation. We worked with him over a period of about 10 years, gradually refining things, and when he retired in 2007, he charged us with taking it forward and developing it further for posterity. Lamar died in 2012. By then, what we were doing had changed its emphasis quite a bit from what had gone before, and so in 2014 we surveyed the practitioners who had trained with us, and people came up with suggestions for a new name. Eventually, we agreed to change the name to Core Postural Alignment, as we felt the name reflected more what the technique had evolved into. It's about aligning your core with gravity. As a result of aligning the body with gravity, it makes all other body work a bit easier to do. You see, when you lose that good relationship with gravity, you then have to hold yourself up against it because the ground reaction force isn't doing it. Now, the first thing that happens is the paraspinal muscles contract to stop you falling forwards. Now, they're not designed to do that for very long, so they recruit the larger postural muscles, so they get involved with it. That starts to change your biochemistry, it starts to change your posture, it starts to change the way that bodies correct vertebral misalignments, because normally the body is self-correcting. So when a vertebra is out of alignment, if it affects the nervous system, that's when, for example, a chiropractor would come along and do an adjustment. Now, usually, the body corrects these misalignments itself by contracting the relevant paraspinal muscles, just like you'd straighten out a tent or a mast by tightening the relevant guy ropes. Now, one of the main reasons for the body not being self-correcting is that the paraspinals are too busy holding you up against gravity. So what we found over the years is by sorting out people's relationship with gravity first, it makes virtually all other body work much easier to do. Now, we were chiropractors when all this started. We were fortunate in that I had a very busy practice in Liverpool. Sue was in London and had a very busy practice there. And as you know, most people come to you via word of mouth. And so they sort of know what to expect. They know what they're coming to. Now, at that time, we were setting up a brand new practice in Staffordshire. So no one knew us or what to expect when they came to see us. So in this practice, we only used this new technique for 6 months. We didn't do any chiropractic, we just used this technique for 6 months. We found it as effective as the chiropractic for most cases. Maybe 5 or 10% of the time we thought that maybe we need to do a little bit of chiropractic here. Now, when you consider it takes 5 years to learn to be a chiropractor, and the average cost worldwide to train as one is about $120,000, you can see why we were blown away by the results we were getting. So we were mightily impressed with the technique, and so we agreed to Lamar's request for us to become the European tutors, and we started teaching it to other practitioners, and it's been a voyage of discovery ever since. The thing to bear in mind is all that we're doing is realigning people with gravity, and their bodies do the rest. Now, more and more people are starting to look at the effects of gravity on the body. Now, the more cutting edge kind of people are thinking now that the way gravity interacts with the body affects the telomeres on the end of the genes. This is an area called epigenetics. Essentially, if you think of a gene as a shoelace and the little aglets on the end, you know, the little plastic bits which help the laces go through the eyelets on the shoes as the telomeres, once the telomeres have gone, then the gene can no longer express itself. It's one of the measures they use for biological age. And people are now doing work looking at how gravity affects telomere survival. That could mean that the more optimal relationship you have with gravity, even life expectancy might be altered. Stress. There's loads of work going on at the moment with the effects of gravity and stress on the body. There's even work on gravity and consciousness. Roger Penrose, he's a mathematician who's a pal of Stephen Hawking's. He was working on the artificial intelligence project. Now, they used to believe that when a structure like the brain became complex enough, consciousness somehow magically arrived. But actually, now they're thinking that consciousness is a property of the universe, and when the brain becomes complex enough, it can access it. Now, these aren't whacked out hippies talking here, but hardline scientists. This is like universal consciousness being expressed through us rather than us projecting it out the other way. But how the brain interacts with consciousness is to do with the quantum effects of gravity on organelles in the neurons. So the way gravity is affecting the body is huge, and we're just beginning to scratch the surface. So you're at the very forefront of knowledge, and when you take this technique out into your practice, you're really at the cutting edge of everything for your recipients. I mean, how fantastic is that? What a service you can offer. It's brilliant. If you can improve someone's relationship to gravity, so many things start to happen. And this is what this course is all about. Now, don't get too hung up on all this. Very often people who are attracted to therapy aren't attracted to physics. Just relax, breathe, and practice the technique as we'll teach it to you. And as a suggestion for excellence in how you should approach this work, we ask that you keep an open mind, listen as if you're hearing these things for the first time, be willing to be influenced, and expect great things.